courtroom was a box of stale air and quiet fear. It smelled like old paper and the nervous sweat of people waiting for their lives to be decided. In this box sat 17-year-old Leo. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't even a witness. He was just there for a traffic ticket, a simple mistake that had somehow landed him in this cold, imposing room. He sat straight in the hard wooden bench, trying to look smaller than he was. His hands were clasped in his lap, his thumbs rubbing over each other again and again. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, judging the way he sat, the way his hair was cut, the way his skin seemed to soak up the dim light. It was a feeling he knew too well, a silent weight that pressed down on his shoulders. Around his neck, he wore a chain. It wasn't thick or flashy. It was a simple, thin gold chain, the kind a boy gets from his grandmother on his 13th birthday. It was more than just metal. It was a memory. It was the feeling of his Nana's soft hands, her proud smile. It was a promise he made to her to always carry himself with dignity, to remember where he came from. The chain was cool against his skin, a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar place. It was his anchor. It reminded him to keep his head up, even when the world tried to push it down. He touched it lightly, a secret handshake between him and his past, a quiet prayer for his future. This chain was his story, hanging right there for everyone to see, even if they couldn't read it. The room was filled with the low murmur of lawyers talking to clients, the rustle of papers, and the rhythmic click-clack of a court stenographer's machine. But to Leo, it was all background noise. The main sound was the pounding of his own heart, a drumbeat of anxiety in his chest. He watched the judge at the front, a stern figure in a black robe, her face unreadable. He watched the lawyers in their stiff suits, moving with a confidence he couldn't imagine having. He watched the other people waiting, their faces etched with worry. Everyone seemed to be playing a part in a play he hadn't rehearsed for. He just wanted to pay his fine and leave. He wanted to be back on the basketball court, where the only judgment came from the scoreboard, but the silence in the room had teeth. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, waiting silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Every cough, every shuffle of feet seemed to echo and die, swallowed by the tension. Leo felt like he was holding his breath, waiting for his name to be called, waiting for his turn to be seen and dismissed. He focused on the American flag standing in the corner, its colors bright against the dull brown walls. He tried to think about what it was supposed to stand for: liberty, justice for all. But in that moment, sitting on that hard bench, those words felt distant. They felt like they belonged to someone else in some other room. A police officer approached Leo's bench. He was a big man, his uniform stretched tight across his broad chest. His face was a mask of authority, his eyes scanning Leo from head to toe. "You, stand up," the officer said, his voice a low growl that cut through the quiet. It wasn't a request, it was a command that expected no argument. Leo's heart jumped into his throat. He looked around, confused. He hadn't done anything. He was just sitting, waiting. He stood up slowly, his legs feeling like jelly. The officer's gaze was fixed on the gold chain around Leo's neck. "What's this?" he asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "You think you're some kind of big shot walking in here wearing that?" Before Leo could answer, before he could explain that it was a gift from his grandmother, the officer reached out, his thick fingers hooked under the delicate chain. Leo flinched back, a reflex of surprise and violation. "It's just a chain," Leo managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "It was my Nana's gift." But the officer wasn't listening. He saw a young black kid with a gold chain and his mind was already made up. He saw a stereotype, not a person. To him, the chain wasn't a symbol of love or memory. It was a symbol of trouble. With a sharp, deliberate tug, he ripped the chain from Leo's neck. The sound was small but violent, a tiny snap of metal that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The chain fell to the floor, broken. A piece of Leo's heart seemed to fall with it. The cold spot on his neck where the chain used to be burned with shame. Humiliation washed over him, hot and suffocating. It felt like everyone in the courtroom was staring at him, their eyes burning holes through his skin. He was no longer a boy with a traffic ticket. He was a spectacle, a lesson. He had been stripped of his dignity, not just his jewelry. The officer had done more than break a chain. He had tried to break Leo's spirit. He had tried to tell him, without words, that he was worthless, that his story didn't matter. Leo's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream. He wanted to disappear. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with low whispers, fell into a deep, profound silence. Every person in the room had seen it. The lawyers stopped talking. The stenographer's fingers froze over her keys. The defendants and their families stared, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and a weary, knowing sadness. This was not justice. This was a raw display of power, an abuse of authority played out for all to see. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken questions and indignation. The broken chain lay on the polished floor, a gleaming, tragic symbol of the moment. It was a line that had been crossed, a trust that had been shattered, and everyone waited to see what would happen next. High above the scene, seated behind the massive wooden bench, Judge Eleanor Vance watched everything. Her face, usually a canvas of calm impartiality, was as still as stone. But behind her eyes, a hurricane was raging. She had seen the officer approach the boy. She had seen the flicker of fear in the boy's eyes. She had heard the snap of the chain, a sound that broke more than just a piece of metal. It broke the sanctity of her courtroom. Judge Vance was known for her fairness, for her unwavering commitment to the law. She ran her courtroom with a firm but respectful hand. What she had just witnessed was a flagrant violation of everything she stood for. It was a perversion of justice, right in her own domain. The boy on the floor was not just another face in the crowd. He was not just another case number on her docket. He was Leo, her son, her brilliant, kind, sometimes goofy son, who loved basketball and his grandmother's stories. The chain that now lay broken on the floor was the one she had helped her own mother pick out for his 13th birthday. She remembered the joy on his face when he received it. She remembered him promising his Nana he would wear it always to remember her love. Seeing it ripped from his neck felt like a physical blow. A storm of emotions swirled inside her, the white-hot rage of a mother, the cold fury of a judge, the deep, aching pain for her child's humiliation. Her mind was a battlefield. One part of her wanted to leap from her seat, to run to her son, to wrap her arms around him and shield him from the cruelty of the world. This was the mother in her, a powerful, primal force that screamed for his protection. But another part of her, the judge, knew she had a different responsibility. She wore the black robe. She held the gavel. Her role was not just to protect her son, but to protect the integrity of the law itself. If she acted solely as a mother, she would lose her authority. But if she did nothing, she would betray not only her son, but every person who looked to her for justice. She had to find a way to be both. She took a slow, deliberate breath, calming the tempest inside her. Her personal feelings had to be channeled into professional action. This was bigger than Leo. This was about the officer who felt so empowered that he could humiliate a citizen in a court of law without fear of consequence. This was about the silent onlookers, too intimidated or too indifferent to speak up. This was about the system that allowed such biases to fester and erupt into acts of casual cruelty. She looked at her son's face, saw the pain and shame etched there, and her resolve hardened into steel. She was not just Leo's mother, she was Judge Vance. And in her courtroom, justice would have the final word. Judge Vance picked up her gavel, but she did not bang it. She just held it. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of that silent room. It was a voice that carried the weight of the law, clear and sharp as glass. "Officer Miller," she said, locking eyes with the policeman who still stood over Leo. The officer turned, a flicker of surprise on his face. He had clearly expected no pushback. He'd expected the silent approval that so often followed actions like his. But now, with the judge looking right at him, for the first time, a hint of unease crept into his posture. He had miscalculated. He had forgotten whose courtroom he was standing in. The entire room just held its breath, waiting. "You will pick up the chain," Judge Vance commanded. Her words were not a suggestion. They were an order, absolute and unyielding. "You will hand it to the young man whose neck you took it from, and then you will apologize. You will apologize for your unprofessional conduct, for your unwarranted aggression, and for dishonoring this court." Every word she spoke was carefully chosen, a precise legal instrument. She wasn't speaking as a mother defending her son. She was speaking as a judge defending the principles of due process and respect that were the bedrock of her authority. She was reasserting the rules, not just for the officer, but for everyone present. She was reminding them all that in this room, power answered to the law. The officer hesitated. His face flushed red with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Apologize? To this kid? In front of everyone? It was a challenge to his pride, to his identity as an enforcer. He looked from the judge to Leo, then back to the judge. Her expression was unmoving, a mask of judicial authority. There was no room for negotiation in her eyes. He knew in that moment that he had no choice. Slowly, stiffly, he bent down. His large frame seemed to shrink as he stooped to retrieve the broken pieces of gold from the floor. The simple act of bending down was a powerful symbol. The man of power was now submitting to the rule of law. The room watched, mesmerized by this quiet, dramatic turn of events. He walked over to Leo, his eyes avoiding the boy's gaze. He held out the broken chain in his open palm. "I apologize," he mumbled, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He just couldn't bring himself to say more. Judge Vance's voice cut through the air again, sharp and clear. "You will look at him when you speak, Officer Miller, and you will state clearly what you are apologizing for." Forced to comply, the officer lifted his head. He looked at Leo, really looked at him, maybe for the first time. "I apologize," he said, his voice stronger now but strained, "for my conduct." It wasn't a heartfelt apology, but it was a public one. It was an admission of wrongdoing, compelled by the authority of the court. Leo stood frozen, the broken chain now resting in his palm. He looked from the officer to the judge, his mind trying to catch up with what was happening. He had been prepared for more humiliation, for dismissal, for injustice. He was not prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for someone to stand up for him, especially not here, not in this place. Seeing the officer forced to apologize, seeing the power dynamic of the room completely flipped, was a surreal experience. A small part of the shame that had been burning inside him began to cool. He was still hurt, but he was no longer just a victim. He was a citizen who had been wronged, and the wrong was being acknowledged. The air in the room had changed. The heavy silence of fear was replaced by a charged silence of awe. Judge Vance was not finished. Her gaze remained fixed on Officer Miller. "Your apology is noted for the record," she said, her tone formal and severe. "However, your actions constitute a serious breach of professional conduct and a contempt for the proceedings of this court." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Bailiffs," she called out, her voice resonating with authority. Two court bailiffs who had been standing by the wall stepped forward immediately. "Please escort Officer Miller from my courtroom. He is relieved of his duty for the remainder of the day. A formal complaint will be filed with the Internal Affairs Division of his department with a full transcript of today's events." The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the two bailiffs flanked Officer Miller. The officer's face was a storm of disbelief and rage, but he knew better than to resist in a courtroom in front of a judge who had just demonstrated her absolute command. He was led away, his authoritative presence deflating with every step. The heavy doors of the courtroom swung shut behind him, the sound echoing like a final, decisive judgment. The message was unmistakable. No one was above the law, not in Judge Vance's courtroom. The removal of the officer was a powerful visual. It showed everyone that actions have consequences, that a uniform and a badge did not grant immunity from accountability. With the officer gone, Judge Vance finally let her gavel fall. The sound was not the sharp crack of a routine ruling. It was a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. It was the sound of order being restored, the sound of justice being served, the sound of a line being drawn in the sand. It was a thunderous declaration that dignity mattered, that respect was non-negotiable, and that the courtroom was a sacred space where the rights of every individual would be protected. For a long moment after the gavel fell, the only sound was the collective exhale of a room that had just witnessed something extraordinary. A chain had been broken, but something much stronger had just been forged. After the officer was removed, Judge Vance addressed the entire courtroom. Her voice was steady, but now it held a different tone, not just of a judge, but of a teacher. "Let what you have witnessed here today be a lesson," she began, her eyes sweeping across the faces of the lawyers, the clerks, the families, and the other defendants waiting their turn. "The law is not merely a set of rules on paper, it is a living covenant of respect. It is a promise that every single person who enters this room will be treated with dignity. That promise was broken today, and it is my sworn duty to ensure that such a breach is not overlooked." She was no longer just ruling on a single incident. She was shaping the culture of her courtroom. She continued, explaining the principle at stake. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place in the administration of justice. Humiliating a citizen, assuming the worst of them based on their appearance, is not law enforcement. It is an abuse of power. It erodes the very trust that our legal system is built upon. Her words were clear and simple, meant for everyone to understand. She wasn't using complicated legal jargon. She was speaking about fundamental human values. The people in the room listened intently. They were no longer just spectators. They were participants in a profound civic lesson. They saw a judge who didn't just enforce rules but embodied the spirit behind them. It was a rare and powerful sight. The event did not stay within the courtroom walls. In the age of smartphones, someone had been recording. The footage of the officer ripping the chain, of Judge Vance's calm and commanding response, of the officer's removal, spread like wildfire across the internet. By nightfall, it was on every news channel and social media feed. The story of the judge and the chain became a national conversation. People debated the officer's actions, but they overwhelmingly praised the judge's response. She became a symbol of integrity and courage. Her actions gave a voice to the frustrations of many who had experienced or witnessed similar smaller injustices go unchallenged every day. The impact on the community was immediate and tangible. Activist groups held her up as an example of what accountability should look like. Law schools began using the clip as a case study in judicial temperament and courtroom management. The police department, facing immense public pressure, launched a swift and transparent investigation. Judge Vance's decision to file a formal complaint, backed by a court transcript, made it impossible to ignore. Her single act of courage had started a ripple effect, forcing a difficult but necessary conversation about policing, bias, and the real-world meaning of justice. It showed that one person acting with conviction from a position of authority could indeed challenge the system. That evening, the black robe was hung up, the gavel was put away. Judge Vance was just Eleanor, a mother. She found Leo in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, the broken chain in his hands. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the drama of the day. She sat down next to him, not as a judge, but as his mom. She didn't say anything at first, just put her arm around his shoulders. He leaned into her, the tension finally leaving his body. "I was so scared," he said, his voice quiet. "I felt so small." She held him tighter. "You were not small, Leo," she said softly. "You were strong. You were dignified. He was the one who was small." She took the broken chain from his hands and looked at it. "We'll get this fixed," she promised. "It's more than just gold, I know." He nodded, looking at her. "What you did today, everyone at school is texting me. They saw the video. They said you were a hero." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "I wasn't trying to be a hero, baby. I was doing my job. My most important job is to be your mother. But my other job on that bench is to make sure the rules apply to everyone, equally." That officer forgot that. I just had to remind him. She was teaching him another lesson, one about legacy and responsibility. Her legacy wasn't just in her rulings, but in the values she passed on to her son. This moment, born of humiliation, became a cornerstone of Leo's understanding of the world. He learned that injustice is real, and it can be brutal and sudden. But he also learned that courage is real too. He learned that one voice speaking with clarity and conviction can change the course of events. He saw firsthand that true strength wasn't in the power to dominate, but in the power to uphold dignity, both your own and others. The repaired chain, when he wore it again, felt different. It was still a link to his grandmother, but now it was also a link to his mother's courage, a reminder of the day the system was challenged and for a moment bent toward justice. The story of the chain that broke the silence became a modern parable. It reminded everyone that justice is not an abstract concept. It is a series of actions, big and small. It is a judge refusing to look away. It is a community demanding accountability. It is a mother telling her son he has worth. It is found in the courage to speak up when every instinct tells you to stay silent. The true meaning of justice isn't written in law books. It is written in the moments when we stand up for one another, when we refuse to let dignity be broken, and when we ensure that every single voice has the chance to be heard, respected, and protected.